but I just wanted to kind of run through those. So a healthcare surrogate is when your resident appoints someone to make decisions for them for their healthcare. So the resident can still make their own decisions, but they also say, this is the person I want to help make decisions if I'm unable to, especially. And these are all documents that you want them to complete ahead of time, because when it comes to healthcare decision making, we all know that not all family members are going to be on the same page, and we want to know what the resident's wishes are. So when you're looking at it, you want to make sure that they're appointing at least 2 people. The reason I always tell people to do that is you never know when there's going to be a death, or somebody that they appointed may develop cognitive issues. I used to go into a retirement community that literally the residents would outlive the residents we were taking care of. Because it would be fellow residents they would appoint as their healthcare surrogates, or we would get a patient who I wasn't certain their healthcare surrogate actually was cognitively intact enough to be making those kind of decisions, and the residents certainly couldn't. So this is another document that the resident can complete to tell not only you as being involved in their healthcare, but also their healthcare surrogates, this is what I do or don't want. This is a great mediation tool to use with families when they're disagreeing if the resident can't speak for themselves. I've pulled out a living will that one of our residents has completed in a meeting and just talked about what they put down in this piece of paper. And again, it's something that they can do ahead of time to tell us. So say your resident has not appointed a healthcare decision maker, they've not completed a durable power of attorney that has healthcare in it. Who do you think would be their decision maker? And I always tell people, think about it in terms of yourself, because I always think this is fascinating when people realize what the state tells us who your next of kin would be. The first is a guardian. So if your resident has been appointed a guardian by the courts, then that is who their proxy decision maker would be. You always want to make sure you're reading the guardianship paperwork, because you want to make sure that it's over the person, and sometimes that he will even spell out that that guardian can make decisions. That's kind of the obvious one. The next, if they don't have a guardian, then it would be their spouse. That's pretty obvious. Would you want your spouse to be making decisions for you, though? Sometimes they're not necessarily, the people closest to you are not necessarily going to be the best in a difficult situation, right? Then it looks at, so if you only have one child, that's easy. But if you have more than one child, the state tells us we have to look at a majority of your adult children who are reasonably available. And this does include adopted children. Recently, I was talking to a new employee who adopted 2 children out of the foster care system to help them. They are now 19 years old, and she was shocked to realize that they would be considered her next of kin, because it wasn't really that parent-child relationship that most people think about, because she adopted them as teenagers. They are still legally her children. And because there's more than one, because she hasn't completed another document to tell us differently, we would have to go to both children to get them to agree. How many times does that really happen if you have multiple children or even multiple siblings? That's the next, well, for some of you who may have younger residents, the next piece would be a parent. So if you don't have a guardian, if you don't have a spouse, you don't have children, then if you have a surviving parent, they would be considered your next of kin. Or it would go to your sibling or your siblings. And then an adult relative. If you didn't have all of the others. It can go to a close friend. I will say every time I've had to go down this part and go this far, a close friend kind of makes me nervous. Because if my resident can't tell me any of their history in a reliable way, I'm just having to take the friend's word for it, that they know them, that they've had conversations with them, and that they have their best interests at heart, right? How many of you have had a resident go in the hospital where they appoint a licensed clinical social worker to make decisions for them? That, for us, typically is only in the hospital settings that they'll do that. It is a licensed clinical social worker, and it will be a social worker that is not in that health system. So if you have a resident that's gone into hospital A, they're not going to have a licensed clinical social worker from that hospital A be their proxy. And when they leave the hospital, they typically are not staying involved for healthcare decision making. Luckily, by the time hospice is involved, they're signing our consents and they're signing a do not resuscitate form before they leave the hospital. So really, there's not a lot of consents that would be needed after